Evelyn Hart's world was bathed in the soft glow of studio lights, a world where every word she spoke held the weight of truth. Seated at the anchor desk, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair framed a face that had become synonymous with American evening news. Her eyes, sharp and blue, like the edge of a well-honed blade, flicked across the teleprompter as she delivered the final lines of her broadcast with the practiced ease of a seasoned performer. And that concludes tonight's report. I'm Evelyn Hart. Thank you for joining us, and good night. The camera's red light blinked off, and the bustling energy of the studio dissipated like the fading echo of a thunderclap. Evelyn exhaled softly, leaning back in her chair as the crew buzzed around her, dismantling the set and preparing for the next segment. It was a scene she knew well, this orchestrated chaos of television production that had been her life for over a decade. Evelyn, that was gold. David Lawson's voice cut through the din as he approached her with a wide grin. He was a tall, wiry man with a mop of unruly brown hair and a perpetual gleam in his eye that spoke of ambition and restlessness. David was the producer who had elevated Evelyn from a regional reporter to a national icon, a man who thrived on sensationalism and spectacle. "Thanks, David," Evelyn replied, her tone measured as she stood up and smoothed out the creases in her tailored navy blue dress. Her wardrobe, like everything else in her life, was carefully curated, sleek, professional, and just the right amount of glamorous. "I felt good about that one." "You should," David continued, walking alongside her as she made her way towards the exit. "But we've got to keep the momentum going. This next story is going to be big, huge even. The senator is neck-deep in scandal, and we've got the exclusive." Evelyn nodded, though her thoughts were already drifting. The mention of the senator reminded her of how far she'd come, of the many high-profile stories that had defined her career, but it also brought to mind the sacrifices she'd made along the way. There was a time when the thrill of chasing the truth had been enough to sustain her, but lately the glittering facade of her life had begun to lose its luster. "Don't worry, David, I'm ready for it," she assured him as they reached the elevator. David stopped just short of the doors, his expression shifting slightly as he looked at her with something akin to concern. "You know, Evelyn, you've been doing this for a long time. Maybe you should take a break after this one, just to recharge." Evelyn forced a smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I appreciate the concern, but I'm fine, really." The elevator doors slid open, and Evelyn stepped inside, waving at David as the doors closed. As the elevator descended, she leaned against the cool metal wall, closing her eyes for a moment. David's words echoed in her mind, not because they were unexpected, but because they touched on something she'd been feeling for some time, a weariness that no amount of professional success could quite erase. When the elevator doors opened again, she was in the lobby, greeted by the familiar sight of bustling reporters, interns rushing about, and the ever-present hum of activity. Evelyn nodded to a few colleagues as she made her way to the exit, her heels clicking rhythmically on the marble floor. Outside, the city was bathed in the golden hues of the setting sun. New York was alive with energy, its streets teeming with people who were unaware of the invisible barriers that separated Evelyn from the rest of the world. As she slipped into the back seat of her waiting car, she felt the familiar tug of loneliness that often accompanied her at the end of the day. The driver, a middle-aged man named Carl, greeted her with a polite nod. "Good evening, Miss Hart. Home?" "Yes, Carl, thank you," Evelyn replied, staring out the window as the car pulled away from the curb. The cityscape blurred into a kaleidoscope of lights and shadows as they made their way to her apartment in the Upper West Side. Her apartment was a reflection of her public persona, elegant, tasteful, and impeccably maintained. The walls were adorned with modern art, and the furniture was a blend of minimalist design and luxurious comfort. But as she stepped inside, Evelyn felt the weight of its emptiness, a stark contrast to the vibrant life she projected on screen. Evelyn dropped her purse on the console table and kicked off her heels, her footsteps echoing softly on the polished hardwood floors. She walked into the living room, where a large window offered a sweeping view of Central Park. The twilight sky was a canvas of deep purples and pinks, and for a moment, Evelyn simply stood there, taking in the beauty of it. But the moment of peace was fleeting. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, and she knew without looking that it was another message from David, probably with updates on the senator's story. With a sigh, she picked up the phone and glanced at the screen. It was, indeed, from David, an article link about the scandal, with a note that simply read, "Tomorrow we go in for the kill." Evelyn tossed the phone onto the couch and sank into an armchair, her mind racing. She should have felt excited, invigorated by the prospect of breaking another major story. But all she felt was exhaustion, and a gnawing sense of discontent that she couldn't quite place. Her thoughts drifted to Mark, her estranged husband. It had been months since they'd spoken, and even longer since they'd last seen each other. Mark had once been her anchor, the one person who understood the demands of her career. But as she rose to fame, he had retreated, unable to bear the relentless spotlight that followed her every move. He had left journalism, seeking solace in a quieter life that Evelyn couldn't or wouldn't join him in. They had parted ways amicably, but the pain of their separation lingered like a dull ache. She missed him, missed the simplicity of their life before the fame, before the pressure to constantly be at the top. As the night descended, Evelyn found herself alone with her thoughts, the glittering city outside her window offering no comfort. She had everything she'd ever wanted: success, recognition, power. But in the quiet of her apartment, it all felt strangely hollow. The morning sun had barely crested over the Manhattan skyline when Evelyn Hart slid into the driver's seat of her black SUV, her mind already racing through the day's agenda. The senator's scandal had broken overnight, and David Lawson had orchestrated an exclusive interview that promised to be the crown jewel of her career. It was the kind of story that could dominate the news cycle for weeks, the kind of story that would keep Evelyn's name on everyone's lips. Her eyes fixed on her phone as she scrolled through the latest updates. The streets of New York were just beginning to stir, the usual cacophony of honking horns and hurried footsteps still muted in the early light. As she navigated through the city, Evelyn's phone buzzed incessantly, texts from David, emails from the network, notifications from social media. It was all noise, a constant hum that she had long since learned to tune out. But today, there was an undercurrent of tension, a sense that everything was moving just a little too fast. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a flashing pedestrian signal. Evelyn glanced up, her gaze catching on a young woman hurrying across the street, a small child in tow. The woman, Jessica Clark, looked harried, her face drawn with the kind of worry that Evelyn knew all too well. Jessica was juggling a grocery bag in one hand and holding her son's hand with the other, her steps quickening as she noticed the car. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Evelyn felt a strange pang of recognition, a fleeting connection between two women whose lives couldn't be more different. But the moment passed as quickly as it had come, and Evelyn's attention snapped back to her phone, where a new email from David demanded her immediate response. Her fingers flew across the screen, crafting a reply that was equal parts sharp and decisive. Notice that the traffic light has changed. The car lurched forward, and in that split second, everything changed. Evelyn heard a sickening thud, followed by the shrill sound of brakes screeching against asphalt. Her heart skipped a beat, and she looked up in horror to see Jessica lying on the ground, her son standing frozen beside her, tears streaming down his face. Evelyn slammed on the brakes, the car coming to a jarring halt. Evelyn's pulse raced as she fumbled with the door handle, her hands trembling. She stumbled out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement as she rushed to Jessica's side. "Are you okay? Oh my God, I'm so sorry." Evelyn's voice was frantic as she knelt beside Jessica, who was groaning in pain, clutching her leg. The groceries lay scattered around her, a carton of eggs smashed on the pavement, milk pooling in the gutter. Jessica's son, a boy of about 5, was sobbing uncontrollably, tugging at his mother's arm. Mommy, are you hurt?" I'm okay, sweetie," Jessica managed, though her face was contorted with pain. She tried to sit up, but winced and fell back, her leg clearly injured. Evelyn felt a surge of guilt and panic rise in her chest. This was her fault. She had been distracted, not paying attention, and now this woman was hurt because of her. "We need an ambulance," Evelyn called out, her voice shaking. "Somebody call 911. A few bystanders had gathered, murmuring among themselves as one of them pulled out a phone to call for help. Evelyn could feel their eyes on her, could sense the judgment in their stares. The irony was not lost on her. Here she was, the woman who had built a career exposing the mistakes of others, now at the center of a crisis of her own making. Within minutes, the wail of sirens filled the air, and a police car arrived, followed closely by an ambulance. The paramedics quickly tended to Jessica, loading her onto a stretcher as Evelyn stood to the side, her mind racing. She watched as the little boy clung to one of the paramedics, too young to understand what was happening. Officer Ben Riley, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached Evelyn. His eyes were sharp, assessing her with the kind of scrutiny that made her feel like she was on the wrong side of the news for the first time in her life. "Ma'am, are you the driver?" he asked, his voice steady and professional. "Yes, I didn't see her. I was distracted and—" Evelyn's voice faltered as she struggled to find the words. She had been in control for so long, always knowing what to say, how to handle any situation. But now, faced with the reality of her actions, she felt powerless. "We'll need to take a statement from you," Officer Riley said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "and we'll have to investigate further." Evelyn nodded, her thoughts a jumble of fear and confusion. She knew what this could mean. Her reputation, her career, everything she had worked so hard for, all at risk. The media would have a field day with this, and she could already imagine the headlines. Top news anchor in hit-and-run scandal. As the paramedics loaded Jessica into the ambulance, Evelyn caught sight of the woman's face, pale and strained, but still managing a faint, reassuring smile for her son. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about the kind of person Jessica was. In that moment, Evelyn felt a pang of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Humility. "Please, let me know how she's doing," Evelyn said to Officer Riley as the ambulance doors closed. "I want to make sure she's okay." Officer Riley nodded, his expression unreadable. "We'll be in touch, ma'am. In the meantime, you should probably contact your lawyer." Evelyn's heart sank at the mention of a lawyer. This was serious, more serious than she had allowed herself to believe. As she watched the ambulance drive away, taking Jessica and her son to the hospital, Evelyn felt a deep sense of dread settle over her. The drive to the station was silent, the weight of what had happened pressing down on Evelyn like a physical force. When she finally arrived, David was waiting for her in the lobby, his face alight with excitement. He had no idea what had just transpired, no idea how Evelyn's world had just shifted on its axis. "Evelyn, you won't believe the dirt I've just dug up on the senator," David began, his voice full of anticipation. But as he saw her face, the excitement faded, replaced by concern. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Evelyn's voice broke, and for the first time in years, she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She quickly blinked them away, trying to regain her composure. "I was in an accident, David. I hit someone." David's eyes widened, and he immediately switched into damage control mode. "What? Are you okay? What about the other person? Was anyone hurt?" "Her name is Jessica Clark. She's a single mother. She was hurt, David, and it's my fault." Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper, the reality of the situation hitting her with full force. David's face hardened as he processed the information. "Listen, Evelyn, we need to handle this carefully. The last thing we need is for this to blow up in the press. You're a public figure. This could destroy you." Evelyn nodded numbly, but her mind was elsewhere. All she could think about was Jessica and her son, and the overwhelming guilt that gnawed at her insides. "I don't know, David," Evelyn said, her voice shaky. "Maybe I should just come clean. I can't keep this a secret. It's not right." David's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "Evelyn, you need to think about your career, about everything you've worked for. I'm not saying we should lie, but we need to control the narrative. Let me handle the media. You just focus on getting through this." Evelyn nodded, though her heart wasn't in it. She knew David was right. Her career, her entire life was on the line. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure if it was worth it. As the day wore on, Evelyn found herself going through the motions, but her mind was far away, consumed by thoughts of Jessica and the boy. The high-stakes interview with the senator no longer seemed important, the thrill of the chase dulled by the weight of her conscience. The morning after the accident, Evelyn Hart's world began to crumble in ways she could never have imagined. She awoke to the shrill sound of her phone vibrating incessantly on the nightstand, pulling her from a restless sleep. The moment she opened her eyes, reality hit her like a freight train. The accident, Jessica Clark, the boy's tear-streaked face. It wasn't just a nightmare, it was all painfully real. Evelyn reached for her phone, squinting at the screen. A flood of notifications greeted her. Texts from David, missed calls from her publicist, and dozens of emails, all demanding her attention. But one headline, splashed across her news feed, sent a chill down her spine. Top anchor Evelyn Hart involved in hit-and-run accident, victim hospitalized. She bolted upright, her heart racing. The story had broken, and there was no going back. The media was already circling like vultures, hungry for every morsel of information. Evelyn felt a wave of nausea as she scrolled through the article, her name linked with phrases like reckless driving and fleeing the scene. A deep sense of dread settled over her as she realized that the life she had so carefully curated was unraveling before her eyes. Within the hour, David was at her apartment, pacing back and forth with his phone glued to his ear. "Yes, we're aware of the situation," he barked into the phone, his face flushed with frustration. "We're handling it." "No, she's not making a statement right now." Evelyn sat on the edge of her couch, staring blankly at the wall as David finally ended the call and turned to her. It's bad, Evelyn. The story's everywhere. We need to get ahead of this before it completely spirals out of control. She nodded, though her mind was still reeling. What do we do? For now, we stick to the facts. You were involved in an accident and you stayed at the scene. We'll emphasize that you called for help immediately and that you're cooperating with the investigation. But Evelyn, David hesitated, his expression softening. We need to be prepared for the fallout. This isn't going to go away quietly. Evelyn knew he was right, but as she listened to David's plan, a gnawing sense of guilt gnawed at her. She hadn't stayed at the scene out of any noble sense of responsibility. She'd been too shocked to flee. And now, that shock was giving way to a deeper fear. The fear that her actions, both past and present, were about to catch up with her. As the day wore on, the media frenzy only intensified. Reporters camped outside her building, cameras at the ready, eager to capture the first glimpse of the disgraced anchor. Inside, the phone rang off the hook. Calls from colleagues, friends, and more than a few rivals. But one name in particular stood out: Thomas Blackwell. Thomas Blackwell was a thorn in Evelyn's side, a rival journalist who had spent years trying to undermine her. They had started their careers around the same time, but while Evelyn had ascended to the top, Thomas had remained in her shadow, always a step behind. His bitterness was well known in the industry, and Evelyn had often dismissed him as nothing more than a jealous adversary, but now he had the story of a lifetime handed to him on a silver platter. It didn't take long for Thomas to pounce. By midday, his byline appeared on a scathing article that delved into the details of the accident, but it didn't stop there. Thomas began to dig into Evelyn's past, uncovering stories she had reported on that now seemed riddled with inconsistencies. He pointed out moments where Evelyn had blurred the lines between fact and fiction, using her influence to push narratives that weren't entirely truthful. The real Evelyn Hart, behind the glamour and deception, read one of his articles, with a subheading that stung: How America's Most Trusted Anchor Built Her Career on Half-Truths. The article was merciless, painting Evelyn as a woman who had clawed her way to the top by bending the truth, manipulating stories to suit her agenda. Thomas referenced old interviews, resurfacing quotes and sound bites that, when taken out of context, painted Evelyn as opportunistic and disingenuous. For the first time in her career, Evelyn found herself on the defensive, and it was a position she was wholly unprepared for. She was used to being the one asking the tough questions, holding others accountable. Now, the tables had turned, and she was the one being scrutinized under the harsh glare of the spotlight. The stress of the situation began to take its toll on her. Her once polished exterior started to fray. Dark circles formed under her eyes. Her normally impeccable hair was hastily tied back, and her usually sharp mind felt foggy and unfocused. Each day brought new revelations from Thomas, new accusations that chipped away at her credibility. Evelyn's only solace came from Rebecca Hayes, a close friend and fellow journalist who had always been in her corner. Rebecca was one of the few people Evelyn trusted implicitly, a confidant who had seen her through the highs and lows of her career. "Evelyn, you need to talk to me," Rebecca urged one evening, after days of unanswered calls and ignored messages. She had come to Evelyn's apartment, refusing to leave until they spoke. Evelyn, her defenses worn thin, finally let her in. They sat in the living room, the same room that had once been a haven for Evelyn, now a prison of her own making. "I don't know what to do, Rebecca," Evelyn admitted, her voice breaking as she finally allowed herself to be vulnerable. "Everything's falling apart. Thomas is out for blood, and I don't know how to stop him." Rebecca reached out, placing a comforting hand on Evelyn's arm. You don't have to go through this alone. But Evelyn, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Evelyn looked up, meeting Rebecca's gaze. There was no judgment in her friend's eyes, only concern and a deep-seated worry. "Did you do the things Thomas is accusing you of?" Rebecca asked, her voice gentle but firm. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat as she struggled to find the words. She wanted to deny it, to tell Rebecca that Thomas was lying, that he was twisting the truth to serve his vendetta. But deep down, she knew that wouldn't be entirely honest. "There were times," Evelyn began slowly, choosing her words with care, "when I might have pushed the boundaries. I didn't lie, but I framed things in a way that made the story more compelling. It wasn't always about the truth. It was about what people wanted to hear." Rebecca's expression didn't change, but Evelyn could see the disappointment in her eyes. It wasn't judgmental, but it was there, a quiet realization that the friend she had always admired wasn't as infallible as she had seemed. "Evelyn, you're one of the best journalists I know. But if you've made mistakes, you need to own them. Trying to cover it up will only make things worse. The truth always comes out, one way or another." Evelyn nodded, tears welling up as she grappled with the reality of her situation. She had spent years building an image, a persona that the public adored. But now, that image was being stripped away, revealing the flawed, fallible person underneath. "Rebecca, I don't know if I can do this," Evelyn confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." Rebecca squeezed her arm reassuringly. "You are strong enough, Evelyn, but you need to be honest with yourself and with everyone else. It's the only way you're going to get through this." Evelyn nodded again, but the weight of Rebecca's words pressed heavily on her chest. Being honest meant facing the consequences of her actions, consequences that could destroy everything she had worked for. It meant admitting that she wasn't the perfect, untouchable figure the public believed her to be. As Rebecca left that evening, Evelyn found herself alone once more, the silence of her apartment echoing with the truth she had tried so hard to avoid. The unraveling of her life was no longer something she could ignore. It was happening, and there was no stopping it. And as the days passed, Thomas Blackwell's relentless pursuit of the truth showed no signs of slowing. With each new revelation, Evelyn felt the walls closing in, the life she had known slipping further from her grasp. The woman, who had once been the face of American evening news, was now a subject of ridicule and scorn, her name synonymous with scandal. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Peter Caldwell's office, casting long shadows across the polished oak desk where Evelyn Hart sat, staring at the stack of papers in front of her. The documents represented the latest development in her spiraling downfall, a lawsuit filed by Jessica Clark's attorneys, claiming reckless endangerment and seeking substantial damages. It was the legal manifestation of the nightmare her life had become. Peter Caldwell, Evelyn's lawyer, and a man known for his calm under pressure, sat across from her, his expression carefully neutral. He was in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair and the steady demeanor of someone who had seen it all. But even he seemed weary as he adjusted his glasses and spoke. "Evelyn, we need to prepare for the worst," Peter said, his tone measured but firm. "The lawsuit is just the beginning. The media is going to latch onto this, and given the circumstances, we're looking at a very public trial. There's no avoiding it." Evelyn's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her glass of water, trying to steady herself. The enormity of what she was facing loomed large, and for the first time, she felt truly cornered. There was no story to spin, no narrative to control, only the cold, hard reality of the consequences of her actions. "What about Jessica? Have you spoken to her lawyers?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've reached out," Peter replied, "but they're adamant. They want justice for Jessica, and they're not willing to settle quietly. The media's involvement has only emboldened them." Evelyn nodded, her mind numb as she processed Peter's words. It was all happening so fast, too fast. Just weeks ago, she had been at the top of her game, the face of American evening news, adored and respected. Now, she was the villain in a story she had no control over. And then there was Sophia, her daughter, her only child. Evelyn's heart ached at the thought of Sophia being dragged into this mess. She had tried to shield her from the worst of it, but the media was relentless. Photographers had staked out her daughter's school. Reporters had hounded her for statements, and the whispers among her peers had grown louder with each passing day. As if on cue, Evelyn's phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Mark Reynolds, her estranged husband. "We need to talk. It's about Sophia." Evelyn's stomach churned with anxiety as she read the message. She hadn't spoken to Mark in months, their communication reduced to terse emails and occasional updates about Sophia. But now, with everything falling apart, she knew it was only a matter of time before he would step back into their lives. "She's just a child, Peter," Evelyn said, her voice breaking as she looked up at her lawyer. "Sophia doesn't deserve this. I never wanted her to be caught in the crossfire." "I know, Evelyn," Peter replied gently. "But the reality is that the media doesn't care about that. They'll use whatever they can to sell their story. The best we can do is to try and minimize the damage. But you need to be prepared. This is going to get worse before it gets better." Evelyn felt a wave of despair wash over her. The public fall from grace was more brutal than she had ever imagined. Her once glamorous life, filled with power and influence, had crumbled into a chaotic mess of legal battles, media scrutiny, and personal turmoil. The veneer of perfection she had worked so hard to maintain was shattered, revealing the cracks that had always been there, just beneath the surface. That evening, Evelyn returned to her apartment, dreading the confrontation that awaited her. Mark had insisted on coming over to discuss Sophia's situation, and she knew it wouldn't be an easy conversation. The tension between them had only grown since their separation, and now, with the scandal tearing their lives apart, it seemed insurmountable. When the doorbell rang, Evelyn hesitated for a moment before answering. Mark stood in the doorway, his tall frame slightly hunched, a weariness in his eyes that mirrored her own. He had aged since they last met, the lines on his face more pronounced, his once dark hair streaked with gray. But there was still that familiar intensity in his gaze, a reminder of the man she had once loved. "Evelyn," Mark said, his voice heavy with emotion as he stepped inside, "we need to talk about Sophia." "I know," Evelyn replied, closing the door behind him. "I'm so sorry, Mark. I never wanted this to happen." Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair as he looked around the apartment. It was immaculate, as always, but there was an air of coldness to it now, a far cry from the warmth of their home when they had been a family. "It's not just about you, Evelyn," Mark said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Sophia's been struggling. The kids at school are talking. The media won't leave her alone, and she's terrified that things are never going to go back to normal." Evelyn's heart broke at the thought of her daughter suffering because of her actions. "I don't know what to do, Mark. I want to protect her, but everything's spiraling out of control." Mark looked at her, his expression softening slightly. "Maybe it's time we take a step back, both of us, for Sophia's sake. She needs stability right now, and I'm not sure she can find that here. Evelyn felt a pang of fear at the implication. You're not suggesting. I'm suggesting that she comes to live with me for a while, Mark interrupted gently. Just until things settle down. I can take her out of the city, away from all this. She needs to feel safe. Evelyn. The words hit Evelyn like a blow to the chest. The thought of being separated from Sophia, of not being there for her, was almost too much to bear. But deep down, she knew Mark was right. Sophia needed a break from the chaos, a chance to escape the relentless pressure that had engulfed their lives. I don't know if I can do that, Mark, Evelyn said, her voice trembling. I can't lose her. You're not losing her, Evelyn, Mark said, his tone softening further. But she needs this, and so do you. You need time to sort things out, to figure out where you go from here. Evelyn closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. The truth of Mark's words cut deep. She was barely holding it together, and Sophia was caught in the middle of a battle she never asked for. Okay, Evelyn finally whispered, her voice barely audible. But please, Mark, take good care of her. She's all I have. Mark nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. I will, Evelyn. I promise. The days that followed were a blur of legal meetings, media appearances, and sleepless nights. Peter Caldwell worked tirelessly to manage the legal fallout, but the scandal had grown too large to contain. Every move Evelyn made was scrutinized, every word she spoke dissected and analyzed. The public, once enamored with her, had turned viciously against her, and the backlash was brutal. As the trial date loomed closer, Evelyn found herself increasingly isolated. The calls from friends dwindled, the support she had once relied on evaporating as her reputation became toxic. Even Rebecca, who had stood by her in the early days, seemed distant, her own career at risk of being tainted by association. Evelyn had always been a fighter, someone who thrived under pressure. But now, with everything she had built crumbling around her, she felt the fight draining out of her. The public fall from grace was more than she had ever anticipated, and the reality of her choices, both past and present, was hitting her with full force. The final blow came in the form of a leaked video, footage from the night of the accident that showed Evelyn, dazed and panicked, struggling to maintain her composure as Jessica Clark lay injured on the ground. The video, captured by a bystander's cell phone, quickly went viral, painting Evelyn as callous and unfeeling in the face of tragedy. It was the last nail in the coffin of her public image. The backlash was swift and unforgiving, with social media erupting in outrage. Evelyn's name trended for all the wrong reasons. The once beloved anchor, now a symbol of everything the public despised about the media. Peter Caldwell called her the moment the video surfaced, his voice tense with urgency. Evelyn, we need to issue a statement immediately. This is bad, worse than anything we've dealt with so far. But Evelyn, sitting alone in her apartment, surrounded by the remnants of her former life, felt a strange sense of calm. The fight was over, the battle lost. She had nothing left to give. No, Peter, she said quietly. No more statements, no more damage control. It's time to face the consequences. Peter was silent for a moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was gentle. Are you sure, Evelyn? There's still a chance we can— No, Evelyn interrupted, her voice firm. I'm done hiding. It's time to accept the truth. And so, as the world watched, Evelyn Hart stepped out of the shadows and into the harsh light of public scrutiny. The woman, who had once been the face of American evening news, was now a cautionary tale, a reminder of the price of ambition and the dangers of losing sight of what truly mattered. as she faced the cameras, the questions, the judgment. Evelyn felt a strange sense of relief. The facade was gone, the truth laid bare for all to see, and in that truth, she found a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in a long time: freedom. For the first time in years, Evelyn Hart was no longer performing, no longer hiding behind a carefully constructed image. She was simply herself, flawed and human, facing the consequences of her choices. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Evelyn knew one thing for sure. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one where she would finally confront the reality of her life and perhaps find a way to rebuild it, brick by broken brick. The courtroom was packed that day, the air thick with anticipation as the judge read the sentence. Evelyn Hart, once a household name, now stood before the court, awaiting her fate. Her face was stoic, but the weight of the moment bore down on her shoulders like a physical burden. The trial had been long and grueling, each day a reminder of how far she had fallen, but now it was almost over. The judge's voice was steady and final. Evelyn Hart, you are hereby sentenced to 6 months in county jail for reckless endangerment, with an additional 2 years of probation following your release. This court expects you to use this time to reflect on your actions and the responsibilities that come with your influence. Evelyn's heart sank as the gavel came down, sealing her fate. The media frenzy outside the courthouse was relentless, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions, all eager to capture the final chapter of her downfall. But as she was led away in handcuffs, Evelyn felt a strange sense of relief. The pretense was gone, the facade shattered. She had hit rock bottom, but in a way it was liberating. There was nowhere to go but up. The months in prison passed slowly. The days were monotonous, filled with chores and reflection. Evelyn kept to herself, spending her time reading and writing, though the words often came slowly, as if she were relearning how to express herself without the pressure of an audience. The other inmates, once curious about her celebrity status, eventually left her alone, and she found solace in the quiet routine. When the day of her release finally arrived, there was no fanfare, no crowd waiting to see her walk out the gates. It was just Evelyn, stepping into the cold winter air, a small duffel bag slung over her shoulder, carrying the few belongings she had left. Peter Caldwell had arranged for her to stay in a small town upstate, far from the media circus that had consumed her life. It was a place where she could start over, away from the relentless scrutiny of the world. The town of Maplewood was a far cry from the bustling streets of New York City. It was quiet, peaceful, with tree-lined streets and small shops that seemed untouched by time. The air was crisp and clean, the kind of air that made you breathe a little deeper, feel a little more alive. It was exactly what Evelyn needed. She rented a modest cottage on the outskirts of town, a small place with creaky floors and a fireplace that crackled warmly in the evenings. It was nothing like the luxurious apartment she had once owned, but it felt more like home than anywhere she had lived in years. There were no reminders of her past here, no photographs or awards lining the walls, just the simple comfort of solitude. For the first few weeks, Evelyn kept to herself, venturing into town only when necessary. The locals were polite but distant, aware of her past but too respectful to pry. She spent her days walking through the woods, letting the tranquility of nature soothe her troubled mind. It was during one of these walks that she met Martha Green. Martha was an older woman, her gray hair pulled back into a loose bun, her eyes sharp and intelligent. She was sitting on a bench near the edge of the forest, a notebook in her lap, scribbling away as the wind rustled through the trees. There was something about her that drew Evelyn in, a sense of quiet wisdom, a life lived fully and without regret. "You're the new woman in town, aren't you?" Martha asked with outright, looking up from her writing as Evelyn approached. Evelyn nodded, unsure of how much the older woman knew about her. "Yes, I am. I'm Evelyn." Martha finally looked up, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I know who you are, and I know why you're here. But that's not what matters. What matters is what you're going to do now." Evelyn blinked, taken aback by the directness of the statement. "I'm not sure," she admitted, sitting down on the bench beside Martha. "I came here to get away from everything, to figure out what's next." Martha chuckled softly. "Getting away is the easy part. Figuring out what's next, that's where the real work begins. But I have a feeling you'll find your way. You're a storyteller, after all." Evelyn looked at her curiously. "How do you know that?" "Because I'm one too," Martha replied, closing her notebook and turning to face Evelyn fully. "I've been a journalist for over 40 years. I've seen it all, the highs, the lows, the truth, and the lies. And I know a fellow storyteller when I see one." There was a pause as Evelyn absorbed Martha's words. She hadn't thought of herself as a storyteller in a long time, not since the accident, not since everything had fallen apart. But hearing it from someone like Martha, someone who had clearly weathered her own storms, struck a chord deep within her. "You should come by my place sometime," Martha continued, her tone inviting. "I live just down the road. We can talk, share stories. I think it might do you some good." Evelyn hesitated, but there was something about Martha's offer that felt genuine, comforting. "I'd like that," she finally said, and for the first time in months, she felt a spark of something she thought she had lost: hope. Over the next few weeks, Evelyn found herself spending more and more time with Martha. The older woman's home was a treasure trove of memories, filled with books, photographs, and mementos from a life lived in pursuit of the truth. They would sit by the fireplace, sipping tea, as Martha recounted tales of her days as a young reporter, the challenges she faced as a woman in a male-dominated industry, and the stories that had shaped her career. Through these conversations, Evelyn began to rediscover her own passion for storytelling. But this time, it was different. There was no pressure to perform, no need to craft the perfect narrative to please an audience. It was just about the story, the truth, unvarnished and raw. One day, as they sat on Martha's porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Martha turned to Evelyn with a thoughtful expression. "You know, there's a young journalist I think you should meet. His name's Jason Walker. He's been following your work for years. Even through all this mess, he's got potential, but he's still green. He could learn a lot from someone like you." Evelyn frowned, unsure if she was ready to mentor anyone, especially after everything she had been through. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that, Martha. I'm still figuring things out myself." "That's exactly why you're the right person," Martha replied with a knowing smile. "Jason's got all of the fire and ambition you had when you were his age, but he needs guidance. And you need to remember what it was like to be that young, that eager to change the world." The next day, Evelyn agreed to meet Jason Walker. He was waiting for her at the local coffee shop, a young man in his mid-20s with a nervous energy that reminded Evelyn of herself in her early days. His eyes lit up when she walked in, and he quickly stood to greet her, almost knocking over his coffee in the process. "Miss Hart, it's such an honor to meet you," Jason said, his voice tinged with admiration. "I've followed your work for years. You're the reason I wanted to become a journalist." Evelyn felt a pang of guilt at his words, knowing how far she had strayed from the ideals that had once driven her. But she also felt a warmth in his enthusiasm, a reminder of what she had once been. "Please, call me Evelyn," she said, offering a small smile as they sat down. "And I'm glad to meet you, Jason. Martha's told me a bit about you." They spent the afternoon talking about journalism, about life, about the mistakes Evelyn had made and the lessons she had learned. Jason listened intently, absorbing everything she said with a hunger for knowledge that was both refreshing and humbling. He asked questions, challenging her on certain points, but always with respect and a genuine desire to learn. As they parted ways, Jason looked at her with a seriousness that belied his age. "Thank you, Evelyn. I won't forget what you've told me today. I want to do this right, to tell the truth, even when it's hard." Evelyn nodded, feeling a sense of pride she hadn't felt in a long time. "You're on the right path, Jason. Just remember, stories matter, people matter, and the truth, it's the most powerful thing we have." In the months that followed, Evelyn continued to rebuild her life, slowly but surely. She wrote again, but this time it was different. The stories she crafted were not for the masses, not for fame or recognition, but for the simple joy of telling them. They were stories about the people she met in Maplewood, about the quiet moments that revealed the depths of the human experience. She found peace in the rhythm of small-town life, in the friendships she formed with people who saw her not as a disgraced celebrity, but as a fellow human being, flawed and searching for redemption. And as she watched Jason Walker grow into a thoughtful, principled journalist, she saw a reflection of her own journey, one marked by mistakes, but also by growth and an unwavering commitment to the truth.